Pilot mocks black woman's flight knowledge, only to discover she's an FAA chief inspector. A hush settled across gate 27B as Imani Johnson stood quietly with her carry-on bag, eyes scanning the crowded waiting area. Nearby, a large digital board displayed the flight's delayed status in glaring red letters. Anyone who saw Imani would have assumed she was just another business traveler, but there was an unspoken confidence about her that suggested she knew more than the average passenger. Unbeknownst to those around her, she held a unique authority within commercial aviation. Today, however, she would encounter a pilot determined to dismiss her expertise, entirely unaware that his condescending attitude might land him in serious trouble. At 5 in the morning, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport was already stirring with life. The great curved ceilings and shiny tiled floors reflected a sense of modern hustle. Flight boards flickered with updated times and gates, while travelers in varying states of grogginess shuffled from check-in counters to TSA lines, coffee cups in hand. The aroma of fresh baked pastries mingled with the faint scent of jet fuel from the runways just beyond thick glass panels. Imani Johnson, a petite woman in her mid-30s, observed everything with a practiced eye. She was dressed casually, jeans, a fitted blazer, and comfortable flats. She carried a leather shoulder bag containing her iPad, personal documents, and a few items that hinted at her profession, though no one would have guessed it from a distance. Her dark hair was styled neatly, and her expression was both focused and relaxed, as if she had a schedule but wasn't flustered by it. The sun hadn't yet fully risen, painting the horizon with a mixture of purples and oranges. Imani paused to admire the sky through a floor-to-ceiling window, a moment of quiet reverence passing over her. She enjoyed these little instants of calm before stepping into the organized chaos that airports embodied. Her official role carried the weight of responsibility. Imani was a Federal Aviation Administration FAA Chief Inspector. She specialized in operational safety and regulatory compliance. In simpler terms, her job was to ensure the aviation industry followed every rule needed to keep the skies safe. She had the authority to ground a plane if it didn't meet standards, to audit an airline if concerns arose, and to review cockpit procedures with an unyielding scrutiny. Many found her presence intimidating once they realized who she was, but Imani carried out her work with empathy, humility, and a steadfast moral compass. She loved aviation, always had, since she was a child watching planes at the local airport with her father. Given her experiences, Imani was no stranger to prejudice and dismissive attitudes. She'd encountered male pilots who believed a woman, and especially a black woman, couldn't possibly match their expertise in aviation. She'd had to win them over with skill, knowledge, and an unshakable calm. Today, she was prepared for another routine flight to Los Angeles, where she planned to conduct a surprise ramp inspection. She didn't expect trouble. Still, she never discounted the possibility. If her years in the industry had taught her one thing, it was to be ready for the unexpected. In her early years with the FAA, Imani had been forced to adapt to an environment where few looked like her. She was often the only black woman in the room, and that pressure transformed into a keen sense of responsibility. She had promised herself she'd pave the way for others, show them they belonged in any field of their choosing. So she kept her voice steady and clear, kept learning, kept flying, and soared above small-minded judgments whenever they arose. She glanced at her boarding pass, Flight 722, operated by Western Winds Airlines, departing Dallas at 7:00 a.m., arriving in Los Angeles at 8:30 a.m. local time. She liked Western Winds well enough. They had a fairly good record with the FAA in terms of safety and compliance, but their financial struggles had led to a few internal cutbacks in the past year. Those cutbacks sometimes resulted in skeleton crews or stretched resources. Imani had been monitoring them closely, as she did any airline showing signs of corner cutting. After passing through security, with minimal fuss, her credentials weren't displayed to anyone just yet. She bought herself a coffee and found a seat near gate 27B. She planned to observe the ground crew operations and passenger boarding. Her schedule didn't require an on-site inspection this trip, but Imani never truly took a break from being watchful. Whenever she traveled, her gaze would linger on the intricacies of airline procedures, the expression on staff members' faces, and the condition of the planes themselves. Sometimes, the smallest detail revealed the largest problem. As Imani sipped her coffee, she overheard a few travelers chatting. A mother reassured her children they'd be on the plane soon. A man in a business suit complained about potential delays. Everyone had somewhere to be, and Imani found their small stories comforting. Travel was a tapestry of personal journeys, woven together in an enormous airport that functioned almost like an independent city. A few gates away, she saw the silhouette of a Western Winds Boeing 737-800 taxiing in. The bright tail fin colors and the airline's emblem glinted in the early morning light. She could almost guess from the ground staff's body language that they were a bit behind schedule. Her phone buzzed with a notification. The flight was delayed 15 minutes. Imani was unconcerned. She had time to spare. A short distance away, she spotted a tall, broad-shouldered pilot exiting the jet bridge from an incoming flight. He wore the crisp uniform of a Western Winds captain. Although Imani didn't know him personally, she recognized his face from a distance. She recalled a colleague mentioning a Captain Mark Griffin. Possibly that was the man standing there, checking his watch impatiently. He had an air of self-assuredness, maybe even arrogance. She noted he was in a heated conversation with a gate agent, something about a quick turnaround. Then he stalked off toward the airline lounge. Imani made a mental note. In her experience, that brand of tension often signaled deeper operational or interpersonal issues. Little did she know how entangled her path would become with Captain Griffin's that very day. Mark Griffin was in his late 40s and had the squared jaw of someone who believed strongly in his own authority. Tall, with broad shoulders and the posture of a man used to giving orders, he walked through the airport as if it were his personal domain. Years of commercial flying had granted him confidence, but also a certain level of cynicism. He considered himself a skilled aviator, a pilot who had earned his stripes through thousands of flight hours and rigorous training. Yet behind that veneer, Mark carried burdens he rarely admitted to anyone: the fear of losing control in a volatile industry, the pressure of schedules that left little room for personal life, and the gnawing worry about pay cuts and job security if Western Winds continued to struggle financially. He had just finished an overnight flight from New York to Dallas, which had been fraught with turbulence and mechanical hiccups. A malfunctioning cabin pressure sensor had forced him to rely on manual cross-check procedures, and the paperwork for that incident had been extensive. He hated writing long post-flight reports more than anything. It felt like a worthless chore, especially since he was convinced the paper pushers at the FAA didn't actually understand real-world flying. So by the time he got to Dallas, he was already in a foul mood. When the gate agent informed him that the flight to Los Angeles was delayed and he would be the operating captain, Mark nearly lost his composure. He wanted a break, a meal, maybe a short nap. Instead, he had to make do with a quick trip to the pilot lounge to splash water on his face. On his way, he fired off a text to his wife, letting her know he'd be late coming home. She replied with a curt acknowledgement. Tension weighed heavily on him, though he refused to show it publicly. It was in that same pilot lounge that he glanced at the rosters and realized a brand new first officer, Jessica Harlow, would be co-piloting with him. Her file indicated limited hours on the Boeing 737. Great, he thought sarcastically, another newbie to babysit. He wasn't inherently opposed to mentoring, but the day's frustrations colored his perspective. Mark believed that younger pilots just didn't put in the same grit or respect for hierarchy. He scanned the lounge, eventually finding Jessica, a slender woman in her late 20s, with bright eyes. She greeted him politely. "Hello, Captain Griffin. I'm First Officer Harlow." He offered a tight smile. "We'll need to hustle. We're behind schedule." "Yes, Captain," she replied, keeping her tone professional. She picked up on his tension immediately, but decided it was best not to engage, focusing instead on reviewing operational notes for the flight. Their next step was to head to the gate. The flight was posted as Western Wind 722 to LAX. Mark had done the DFW LAX route many times, typically a straightforward run of about 3 hours. As they made their way, he noticed Imani Johnson from a distance. She was an unfamiliar face, and she looked calm, almost too calm. He paid her no mind beyond a cursory glance. He had bigger concerns, ground checks, passenger boarding, and departmental protocols that often felt like hoops to jump through. By 6:40 a.m., Imani stood near the boarding lanes. First Officer Jessica Harlow was already at the podium, signing off paperwork with the gate agent. Their flight had narrowed the delay from 15 minutes to 10, and they hoped to make up more time en route. Captain Griffin arrived, greeting the gate agents brusquely. He barely acknowledged Imani, other than giving her a quick once-over glance that hinted at disdain for any passenger who might slow his day further. Imani, however, stood quietly, studying the subtle tensions between the flight crew members. She caught Jessica's nervous posture, the way Mark tapped his foot impatiently, and the gate agent's forced smile. Yet Imani maintained a low profile. She was traveling in a personal capacity, but knew her position warranted vigilance. When the call for pre-boarding began, Imani advanced with a small group that included older passengers and a family with young children. She overheard Mark complaining to Jessica about civilians who think they know everything. Imani wondered what or who had triggered that remark, but she kept her eyes forward. She reminded herself, "You're not on official business." Still, any sign of disrespect or unsafe practice would be something she noted mentally. Taking her seat, 3A in business class, Imani positioned herself near the front of the aircraft, not far from the cockpit door. Over the years, she'd picked up the habit of selecting seats that granted her a good vantage point. She wanted to see how flight attendants managed the cabin, how the cockpit crew interacted with them, and how swiftly the cabin was prepared for takeoff. She observed the overhead bins, the safety cards in the seatback pockets, the condition of the seats. Everything seemed in order at first glance. As the last of the passengers boarded, Imani noticed an older gentleman struggling to fit his carry-on in the overhead compartment. She stood to assist. "Here, let me help you, sir," she offered, and they managed to angle his bag just right to make it fit. He thanked her sincerely, commenting on how nice it was to see people helping each other. Imani nodded, returning to her seat. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Mark busied himself with the checklists. APU on, battery on, ground power connected, he called out. Jessica responded promptly, matching his pace. However, Mark's annoyance lingered. He found small critiques for everything Jessica did, from how she read off certain lines of the checklist to her immediate responses on the radio. Jessica tried to remain professional, but she sensed the friction. "Seems all right from the tower," Jessica noted. "Weather is clear toward La, just some light crosswinds near the desert." Mark only grunted. "We'll see," he said, flipping switches. "I've flown through enough to know the forecasts can be worthless." "Keep your eyes open." The undercurrent of condescension was evident. By 6:55 a.m., the cabin doors were closed, the jet bridge pulled away. Imani noticed from her window that the pushback tug approached promptly. She nodded in quiet approval. Ground operations were running efficiently after all. A flight attendant, wearing a Western Winds uniform with a warm smile, explained the safety procedures. Imani followed along, partly out of professional habit. The older gentleman next to her sighed. "I've flown 1,000 times, but you never know, right?" Imani responded gently. "Exactly. It's always good to pay attention, just in case." The plane started to push back, engines whirring to life. Imani felt that familiar sense of awe at the power beneath her, something she'd never grown tired of. She'd experienced it from the cockpit side before, but she still found joy in being a passenger, watching the mechanical ballet unfold. As the plane taxied to the runway, Imani glimpsed Mark and Jessica in the cockpit through the tiny gap in the open flight deck door. Mark wore a rigid expression, posture upright. Jessica managed the radio communication, her voice calm over the intercom. Within minutes, Flight 722 roared down the runway. Imani felt the acceleration push her against her seat. The takeoff was smooth, and she once again admired the skill of even the most stressed pilot. She'd rarely encountered a commercial pilot who couldn't handle takeoff. The nuances in how Mark would handle the rest of the flight, however, were yet to be seen. Once airborne, the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. Flight attendants began their service, handing out beverages and small snacks to the passengers up front. Imani requested a sparkling water, scanning the cabin as she did. The older gentleman next to her dozed off almost immediately after finishing his coffee. From the overhead speakers, Mark's voice filled the cabin. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Griffin speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Weather looks clear, and we expect a nice, smooth ride into Los Angeles with just a small crosswind near our approach. Appreciate your patience with the minor delay. We should arrive close to our scheduled time. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight," the standard, reassuring script of a pilot. Imani settled into her seat, feeling the gentle hum of the aircraft. She was content to read a novel on her tablet, though her ears remained open to any sign of trouble. She had no idea that soon Mark would put his foot in his mouth in a way that would shift the tone of the entire flight. At around 40 minutes into the flight, Imani decided to stretch her legs. She quietly navigated the aisle, mindful not to jostle other passengers. Making her way toward the front, she noticed Jessica step out of the cockpit for a quick bathroom break. The flight attendant, Kayla, was preparing the beverage cart. Kayla recognized Imani from earlier assistance with the overhead bin. "Ma'am, can I get you anything else?" she asked politely. Imani smiled. "I'm good, thanks. I might just stand for a minute." She lingered near the front galley, sipping the last of her sparkling water. From there, she overheard Mark's voice filtering through the slightly ajar cockpit door. He was speaking to someone, likely a flight attendant, who had stepped inside to offer coffee or a snack. "Yeah, it's always something," Mark was saying. "Either the airline's cutting corners or some armchair expert passenger is complaining. You'd be amazed at the nonsense I hear. People who read an article online and think they know how a plane works better than me. I've done the hours, you know? I've flown the big jets. I have real experience." The flight attendant's response was polite but inaudible. Mark continued, "The worst is when someone tries to talk to me about regulations. Believe me, I don't need the FAA's constant interference telling me how to do my job, especially from some pencil pusher who's never touched a flight stick in real conditions." Imani felt her jaw tighten. She wasn't naive. She knew many pilots had frustrations with FAA regulations. But there was something raw in Mark's tone, a resentment that went deeper than mere annoyance. She recognized the archetype, the pilot who believed rules were more of a hindrance than a necessity, who placed personal experience above institutional guidance. She'd encountered that attitude before, and it could be dangerous. Jessica returned from the lavatory, carefully squeezing past Imani in the narrow space. She offered a quick smile before re-entering the cockpit. Imani moved aside, deciding she'd heard enough. She'd remain an observer for now, but Mark's attitude was a red flag. If he was careless or dismissive of regulations, Imani might have to assert her authority. Yet, it was crucial to handle such confrontations discreetly, especially on an active flight. Returning to her seat, Imani tried to focus on her e-book, yet Mark's words kept replaying in her head. She recalled the times she'd worked closely with conscientious pilots who understood the purpose behind each regulation. The best aviators appreciated that the rules were forged from past tragedies, near misses, and the collective knowledge of countless experts. Mark, on the other hand, saw them as meddling. Eventually, Imani dozed off. The gentle vibration of the plane lulled her into a light sleep, filled with half-dreams of checklists, air traffic control chatter, and her father's voice from years ago telling her, "One day, Eb, you'll be the one to make a real difference up there." A sudden jolt brought Imani out of her light doze. The seatbelt sign pinged back on. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign due to some unexpected turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Imani sat upright, scanning the cabin. She could feel the plane bounce slightly, an indication of mild turbulence. She checked her watch about an hour and a half into the flight. The lights flickered momentarily, but nothing alarming. She felt a tinge of tension, though. Pilots typically warn of known turbulence in advance, so this might have been a sudden shift that popped up on the radar. She mentally noted to watch how Captain Griffin handled it. The older gentleman next to her awoke, blinking in confusion. Imani reassured him softly, "Just a bit of rough air." "Should be fine," he nodded, clasping his hands on his lap. After a few minutes, the turbulence subsided. The seatbelt sign remained on, though, which was not unusual. Pilots sometimes wait a bit to be sure the rough patch has fully passed. Imani quietly studied the engine's pitch and the subtle movements of the aircraft, gauging the skill of the cockpit crew. Everything seemed fine. Then came an unexpected announcement. Mark's voice resounded. "Flight attendants, please prepare for a possible diversion. We've received notice of potential weather disturbances closer to Los Angeles, and we might have to reroute." Imani felt a ping of alarm. She checked the weather radar app on her tablet, though it was a public flight tracking tool, not an official feed. The forecast near LAX showed only mild crosswinds. Maybe there was a sudden front coming in? It wouldn't be the first time, yet Imani's gut told her something else was at play. Could Mark be overreacting, or was there a mechanical issue? The flight attendants moved swiftly, quietly conferring with each other. Passengers seemed confused, whispering among themselves. Imani overheard a woman behind her ask her traveling companion, "What's a diversion? Are we landing somewhere else?" "Possibly another airport," Imani answered quietly over her shoulder, "but we don't have full details yet." Eventually, Mark came back on the intercom. "We're re-evaluating the situation, folks. Sit tight, and we'll keep you updated." There was a hint of annoyance in his voice, as if the entire affair was a personal affront. Imani could only wonder, was this about the weather, or was Mark making a point about something else? The older gentleman next to her turned concerned eyes toward Imani. "You seem to know a bit about flying. Should we be worried?" Imani gave him a reassuring nod. "I'm sure the crew is just taking precautions. It's their job to keep us safe." That was the most diplomatic answer she could give. Inside, she was a knot of uncertainty. Her instincts told her that Mark's approach might be influenced by something more than safety. Maybe he was pushing for a diversion as a statement of authority, or he was truly worried about conditions. Around them, the plane carried on, pressing through the skies, toward the west. The flight attendants continued their duties, though with a noticeable edge of tension. Imani decided it would be wise to quietly make her presence known to one of the senior flight attendants, just in case anything more serious arose. She stood as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off and discreetly asked Kayla, "Is everything all right?" The pilot mentioned a possible diversion. Kayla's brow furrowed. "We're not certain." Captain Griffin's in contact with dispatch. Los Angeles approach might be facing heavy winds later in the afternoon, but we're not even close to that time frame yet. We're just following orders. Imani nodded. Understandable. If you need any assistance from an FAA standpoint. She paused, weighing her words carefully. I'm knowledgeable about flight operations. Kayla looked confused. You're with the FAA? She asked in a hushed tone. Imani offered a small smile, but didn't elaborate further. Just keep me in the loop if things escalate, please. I won't step on any toes unless necessary. Kayla acknowledged with a nod, and Imani returned to her seat, not wanting to draw attention. She decided that if Mark's potential diversion was truly for safety, that was fine. However, if it were an unnecessary move, due to personal frustration or to prove a point, Imani couldn't stand by and let that happen. She pulled up the FAA flight regulation texts on her tablet, refreshing herself on the specific codes pertaining to in-flight diversions. She was always thorough. An hour later, Flight 722 began its gradual descent, still apparently on schedule for Los Angeles. Whatever Mark's earlier concerns had been, they seemed to have dissipated. The seatbelt sign turned on once more. Passengers prepared their seats and tray tables for landing. The typical hush of anticipation fell over the cabin. Imani noticed, however, that the plane was aligning itself somewhat off the usual approach path she was accustomed to when arriving from Dallas. She'd flown into LAX countless times and recognized certain landmarks. Her curiosity piqued, but she reminded herself that air traffic control might have simply assigned a different approach or runway. Suddenly the overhead speaker crackled, and Mark's voice broadcast a sardonic tone. All right, folks. Looks like we'll be making a standard approach after all. Whatever weather patterns were rumored have cleared up, and to all you backseat pilots who might have read an article or two online, this is exactly why you leave the flying to the professionals. We'll get you on the ground soon enough. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers likely didn't realize the implication, but Imani heard the jab clearly. She felt annoyance rise within her. Mark was effectively taunting anyone who questioned his decisions. The plane touched down on the runway with a slight bump. Brakes engaged, thrust reversers roared, and eventually Flight 722 taxied to its assigned gate at LAX. It was routine, perfectly ordinary, aside from the tension Imani sensed. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, Imani stood, collecting her carry-on. She could see Mark stepping out of the cockpit to bid farewell to disembarking passengers. Jessica was close behind, wearing the polite smile expected of flight crew. Imani expected a standard routine. Yet, as she moved toward the exit, she heard Mark's voice again. He was talking to a passenger who had apparently questioned him about the earlier diversion announcements. A tall man wearing a polo shirt was asking, "Was that bad weather you were worried about earlier? I was checking a flight tracker, and it didn't show much." Mark's response came loaded with condescension. "Well, that's the difference between real-time flight data from the cockpit and the half-baked stuff on phone apps. Maybe next time, just trust the pilot, okay, pal?" The passenger looked taken aback but nodded, stepping away hurriedly. Imani's ire flared. This wasn't just standard curt behavior, it was borderline unprofessional. She approached the cockpit door, waiting her turn to deplane. As she neared, Mark gave her a once-over. She offered a polite greeting. "Good flight overall, Captain," she said, forcing a neutral tone. Mark rolled his eyes slightly, seemingly uninterested. "Thanks," he replied, adding under his breath, "You folks watch too many videos on the internet about how planes work, one swear." Imani paused, arching an eyebrow. I'm not sure I follow, Mark smirked. I see it every day. Someone with a keyboard or a smartphone believes they can do my job. Maybe read a bit about aerodynamics or instrumentation and assume they know the first thing about commercial aviation. Imani felt her pulse quicken. She took a calming breath. Actually, she replied carefully, some of us have more in-depth knowledge than you might expect. He let out a soft chuckle. Right. Let me guess you read about crosswinds on a blog somewhere. He spoke loudly enough for Jessica and a couple of flight attendants to hear. Jessica's eyes widened, and the flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. At that moment, Imani made a choice. She decided to assert herself just enough to remind Mark that he didn't have the monopoly on expertise. I've done more than reading. I've logged flight hours, worked with airline operation teams, and I'm quite familiar with FAA regulations. This flight was, shall we say, interesting from that standpoint. Mark's face darkened. His reflex was immediate. Oh, an FAA fan, are you? Well, let me tell you something. All those bureaucrats sitting in offices with their rule books, they don't get what it's like in the real cockpit, dealing with real-time decisions. I suppose you're going to lecture me about this flight, huh? He wore a mocking grin, certain that Imani was just another know-it-all civilian. Imani tilted her head. Before she could respond, Mark continued, Yeah, well, you do your internet research. I'll do the actual flying. Maybe next time you can save me the talk, miss. He looked at her seat number on the passenger, manifest in his hand. Miss Imani Johnson. She gave a tight-lipped smile. Thank you for the flight, Captain, she said. Then, in a measured tone, I'll remember this conversation. Without waiting for more, she turned and left the aircraft, leaving Mark blinking in confusion. Jessica and the nearby flight attendants sensed something significant had just happened, but Mark seemed oblivious, too proud of himself for having the last word, if he only knew. Imani stepped into the jet bridge, the hum of the ventilation systems filling her ears. She felt her heart pounding. While she was accustomed to being underestimated, Mark's open mockery was grating. She didn't wear her FAA badge in flight because she wanted to avoid unnecessary attention, but at times like these, she pondered the satisfaction that might come from showing her credentials to such a pilot. Still, Imani preferred professionalism over personal vindication. The question was, how far had Mark gone in violating regulations or simply demonstrating unprofessional conduct? It was borderline, but Imani had certainly encountered worse. As Imani reached the terminal, she moved to a seating area near the arrival gate, taking a few moments to compose herself. She pulled out her phone and checked messages. She had an appointment in a few hours, an informal ramp inspection scheduled at LAX for a different airline. She decided she might also discreetly inquire about Western winds and Captain Griffin. That was within her purview after all. Maintaining a safe aviation environment was her job. A tap on her shoulder startled her. Turning around, she saw First Officer Jessica Harlow. The younger pilot looked hesitant, almost shy. "Excuse me, Miss Johnson," she said quietly. Imani stood. "Yes." Jessica glanced around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "Look, I'm sorry about Captain Griffin's behavior. I overheard him. That was uncalled for. He's been under a lot of stress, but that doesn't excuse how he talks to passengers sometimes." Imani sighed. "I appreciate that, First Officer Harlow, but please don't feel responsible for his actions." Jessica nodded, her eyes serious. "I just wanted to check if you were all right. And also, you mentioned FAA regulations on board. Are you with the FAA?" Imani studied her for a moment. Jessica seemed earnest, not someone who'd run to Mark with the information. Finally, Imani reached into her bag, taking out a small leather holder. She flipped it open just enough for Jessica to see her identification. The flash of the FAA emblem was unmistakable. Jessica's eyes widened in surprise. Then respect. "Oh my goodness," she murmured. "I had no idea." Imani gave a slight shrug. That's usually the point. I rarely travel on official capacity in uniform or with a big display. I prefer to observe things as they truly are. Jessica swallowed. Well, if you need anything, I can give you my contact information. I've been concerned about some of Captain Griffin's decisions and attitudes lately. But I don't want to overstep my position. I'm still new, and I worry about retaliation. Imani understood the conundrum. Your discretion will be respected, Imani assured her, pulling out her phone. If you want to share anything, you can message me. I'll look into it accordingly, and no one has to know where I got the information. They exchanged details. Jessica's hands trembled slightly, but she seemed resolute. I became a pilot to ensure passenger safety and to do a job I love. I just want you to know that not everyone is like Captain Griffin. Imani smiled warmly. I know, Jessica, and keep that passion for safety. Don't let this environment discourage you. Jessica seemed relieved, nodding in thanks before heading off to debrief with the flight team. Imani watched the young pilot go, her mind already spinning with how to handle the unfolding situation. She was due to meet with an FAA colleague later that day. Perhaps she'd mention Captain Griffin's name, see if any complaints or flags had been raised in the past. By early afternoon, Imani was seated in an office within LAX's terminal complex, going through routine oversight tasks with her colleague, Robert Tang, another FAA inspector. The offices were modest, tucked away from the bustling passenger areas. Large windows overlooked the tarmac, where planes taxied in and out with rhythmic precision. So, Imani, Robert began, how was your flight in? No issues, I assume? Imani leaned back, exhaling. Actually, there might be something worth noting. I flew Western Winds 722 with Captain Mark Griffin. Let's just say he was quite vocal in his disdain for FAA protocols and seemed to consider them a nuisance. He also made a big show of taunting any passenger who dared question him. Robert frowned, typing into his computer. Mark Griffin. Let me pull up Western Winds records. We do have some notes on him from a prior incident. Nothing major, but a complaint about unprofessional communication with ATC. That was about a year ago. Another note indicates he's had a frictional relationship with management, but no official violation we could act on. Imani chewed on her lip. I got the sense he was borderline, potentially undermining safety if he lets his pride get in the way, and his first officer, Jessica Harlow, approached me privately to express concern about some of his decisions. She's green, so she's afraid to come forward openly, Robert nodded. Understood. We can keep an eye on him, see if more red flags pop up. That said, Imani, you're a chief inspector. If you feel the need to do a direct intervention, you've got the authority. She sighed, gazing at the airport operations outside. I don't want to launch an investigation without substantial cause. But if Captain Griffin is truly endangering flights, we have to step in. I'll let this sit for now, see if anything else surfaces. They wrapped up their meeting and parted ways. Imani had several hours before her ramp inspection at 6 p.m., so she decided to grab a late lunch in the terminal. She chose a quiet cafe, ordering a sandwich and a bottle of water. As she sat nibbling on her meal, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica. Captain Griffin's next flight is 4:30 p.m. to Seattle. He's complaining about you, I think. He's telling everyone about this know-it-all passenger. Imani read the message, feeling a mix of annoyance and amusement. She typed back, noted, "Stay safe." Imani briefly wondered if she should do a surprise inspection on that Seattle flight, but she didn't have the immediate authority to alter her assignment schedule for a petty reason. She needed something more concrete, a real cause to suspect a violation of safety protocols. She reminded herself that Mark's arrogance, while unpleasant, wasn't in itself a regulatory breach unless it manifested in unsafe decisions. She finished her lunch, then spent the next few hours overseeing the scheduled ramp inspection for another carrier. Yet Imani's mind kept drifting back to Mark. He was the type of pilot who might eventually let his ego override procedure. Or maybe he was simply mouthy without crossing the line. She'd have to see what the future held. 2 days later, Imani found herself back at LAX, having stayed in town for additional oversight duties. She scanned the departure boards. Her flight home to Dallas was Western Winds 909 at 2:00 p.m. She had half an hour before boarding, so she walked leisurely toward the gate. Her phone vibrated, a text from Jessica. "I just saw your name on the passenger manifest for flight 909. Captain Griffin is piloting that flight." Imani felt her heartbeat accelerate. Fate had handed her a second encounter with Mark. When Imani arrived at gate 35A, she spotted Mark near the desk, once again radiating impatience. He didn't notice her right away. Jessica stood to his side, quietly listening as he vented about a minor mechanical check delaying their boarding. Imani took a seat where she could watch the drama unfold. Mechanics were at the aircraft's nose landing gear, apparently verifying a sensor reading. Imani saw them conferring with airline staff, an expected procedure. She was relieved Western Winds was thorough enough to check any irregularities, rather than ignoring them. Mark, however, looked irate. He paced, occasionally throwing his hands up. Jessica nodded politely whenever he directed his monologue at her, but Imani saw the tension in her eyes. Finally, passengers began to board. Imani queued up in business class. She noticed Mark's sharp glance as she approached the podium. His eyes flickered with recognition. A smirk formed on his lips, as if he relished the opportunity for a round two. Once on board, Imani settled into seat. 2 minutes later, Mark entered, addressing passengers with forced cordiality as they filed down the aisle. He avoided direct eye contact with Imani, but a mocking smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Imani pretended not to notice, adjusting her phone to airplane mode. The flight attendant secured the cabin, and soon the aircraft pushed back. The engines whined into action. Imani calmly watched the safety demonstration, aware that Mark's presence might be building to another confrontation. This time, however, Imani had no intention of letting him belittle her again, especially if he compromised the flight's safety or the comfort of the passengers. The Boeing 737 soared into the sky, leaving LAX behind. Turbulence was minimal, and the flight progressed smoothly at first. About an hour in, Imani felt the plane level off at cruising altitude. Flight attendants began beverage service, the soft clink of cups echoing in the aisle. But then, Imani noticed something peculiar. The overhead compartments near row 6 were rattling. She glanced around, watching as a couple of passengers looked up nervously. It wasn't unusual for compartments to vibrate slightly in flight, but this seemed more pronounced. Imani signaled the flight attendant. Kayla, the same flight attendant from the previous journey, approached. "Miss Johnson, is everything all right?" "There's a rattling above row 6, Imani explained quietly. "It could be a loose latch or a misaligned bin. Might be nothing, but you may want to check." Kayla nodded. "Thank you, I'll take a look." She walked over, gently opened the bin, rearranged the bags, and ensured the latch was secure. The rattling subsided. As Kayla returned, Imani gave a small smile of appreciation. Just then, Mark's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 36,000 feet, with clear skies ahead. We'll be starting descent in about an hour and a half. Meanwhile, remember to trust your crew if anything comes up. We've got a couple of well-intentioned amateurs on board who might stir concern, but rest assured, we're the experts here." Imani froze. That was unmistakably directed at her. She could see other passengers exchanging glances, confused about whom the captain was referring to. A wave of anger coursed through her. This was beyond poor taste. He was essentially ridiculing her to the entire cabin, implying that a passenger raising concerns about the overhead bin rattle was stirring concern. Imani took a breath, reminding herself of her role. She had the authority to address safety issues, but she also had to maintain professionalism. She signaled Kayla again. "Yes, Miss Johnson?" Kayla asked softly, her eyes uneasy. Imani kept her voice low. "I need a word with the captain professionally. Would you inform him that I'm requesting a brief conversation?" Kayla's eyes widened. In the cockpit, Imani shook her head. "No, we can't break sterile cockpit protocol without cause. Ask him to step out briefly when convenient, or, if procedure allows, I can speak to him via the interphone from the galley. Let him know I'm an FAA official." Kayla's expression shifted to shock. "Understood," she said, scurrying away. Moments later, Imani saw Kayla speak quietly to Jessica, who nodded and relayed a message through the cockpit door. A few minutes elapsed in tense silence before the overhead speaker clicked. "Flight attendants, remain in your stations." Imani anticipated a response from Mark, but none came. Instead, Jessica stepped out of the cockpit, closing the door behind her. She approached Imani, voice hushed. "Captain Griffin refuses to speak to you privately. He said he has nothing to say to a passenger critic." Imani felt her patience wearing thin. She glanced around at the other passengers, aware they were overhearing bits of tension. This was quickly becoming a fiasco. Under normal circumstances, Imani would wait until after the flight to confront Mark. But his brazen attitude, especially after she identified herself as an FAA official, was concerning. She weighed her options. Legally, a pilot has the authority to refuse cockpit access to unauthorized persons during flight. Imani might outrank him in regulatory matters, but in flight, the captain's decisions often stand for immediate flight deck access. Still, Imani had a direct line to the FAA. She could escalate if necessary. "Thank you, Jessica," Imani said. "Please let the captain know that I'll be filing a formal report regarding his conduct. This is unacceptable." Jessica nodded, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Understood," she whispered, heading back to the cockpit. Imani sat down, her heart pounding. This confrontation was the last thing she wanted mid-flight. She believed in resolving issues quietly, but Mark's open mockery was untenable. The remainder of the flight was wrapped in a tense cloud for Imani. She stared out the window at the cottony clouds, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She recalled her father's words, "Stay steady, Imani, storms pass, and the best pilots navigate them with poise." The flight's landing in Dallas was smooth, contradicting the turmoil within Imani. Once the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt signs switched off, Imani stood. She waited as passengers filed out, overhearing comments like, "What was that all about?" and "Did the captain have an issue with someone?" Imani's cheeks burned at the attention. Finally, the aisles cleared. Jessica emerged again, offering a small nod, inviting Imani forward. Imani approached the cockpit door. Mark stood there, arms folded, wearing a smug expression. "So, Miss Johnson, did you have a nice flight?" he asked, sarcasm dripping from his words. Imani met his gaze calmly. "As a passenger, not particularly. As an FAA Chief Inspector, I'm concerned about your behavior and lack of professionalism." For a second, Mark's confident veneer cracked. "Chief Inspector?" he echoed. He glanced at Jessica, who kept her head down. Then he burst out laughing, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "Sure. Let me see some credentials, Chief Inspector." Imani took out her leather ID holder, flipping it open. The official badge and identification were undeniable. Mark's laughter died in his throat. His face paled. Jessica took a step back, as if trying to distance herself from the unfolding scene. The flight attendant, Kayla, stood frozen nearby. "In that case," Mark said, his voice cracking slightly, If you have concerns about the flight, you can file a complaint with the airline. But you have no right to come in here and, Imani cut him off, her voice measured but firm, Captain Griffin, by FAA regulations. If I, an FAA Chief Inspector, witness conduct that compromises the safety or violates any regulatory guidelines, I do have the authority to investigate further, even on the spot, if necessary. She paused, letting her words settle. You repeatedly belittled me, other passengers, and your own first officer. You disregarded a direct request for a professional conversation, which, while within your right, reflects poorly on your willingness to engage with federal oversight. Mark's jaw tensed, eyes darting toward Jessica as if to find support. She offered none. He turned back to Imani, attempting a more placating tone. All right, miss. Johnson Inspector, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. It's been a stressful day, and I didn't realize you were, well, with the FAA. Imani gave a short nod. I'm aware that can be stressful, but your attitude could pose a real risk in decision-making scenarios, especially if you allow personal biases to interfere with objective judgments regarding safety. He swallowed, clearly worried about losing his job or facing suspension. His voice dropped. Well, look, I don't want any trouble. We landed safely, didn't we? No harm done. Imani felt a swirl of emotions. She wanted to both admonish him and show fairness. Safe landings don't negate poor conduct, nor do they undo the possibility that your decisions might one day be compromised by arrogance or a lack of respect for protocols. I'll be filing a formal incident report regarding your behavior. Then it's up to the FAA to decide how to proceed, potentially requiring you to undergo additional training or assessment. Mark's knuckles whitened. He seemed on the verge of snapping back, but he held his tongue. Imani gave him one final, pointed look, then stepped aside. She nodded to Jessica, who whispered under her breath, "Thank you," and Imani walked off the aircraft, heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and lingering anger. In the weeks that followed, Imani completed her official report. She was careful to include every detail: Captain Griffin's public mockery, his refusal to engage in a professional dialogue when asked by an FAA official, and his previous questionable attitude from the first flight. Jessica quietly submitted an anonymous statement supporting Imani's account, describing Mark's condescension and potential disregard for certain safety advisories. At first, Imani heard little about the ongoing investigation. She knew the FAA's bureaucratic wheels turned slowly. Western Wind's management contacted her, offering apologies and assuring her the matter was taken seriously. Imani remained neutral, letting the process unfold as it was designed. Then, one Monday morning, Imani received an email from her supervisor. It contained official confirmation that Mark Griffin was being placed on administrative leave pending a fitness for duty evaluation. If the airlines and FAA's joint inquiry found him unfit or in need of remedial training, he could face suspension or potentially lose his license. Imani exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't delight in the downfall of a pilot, but she recognized the necessity. The system existed to protect lives, not to serve fragile egos. Days later, Imani was in her office at FAA headquarters, reviewing documentation on an unrelated matter, when her phone rang. She recognized the voice on the other end. "Mark Griffin, how did you get my direct line, Captain?" Imani asked, trying to maintain a professional tone. He sounded defeated, the arrogance from before replaced by desperation. "The airline gave it to me. I wanted a chance to apologize and maybe talk about my hearing. They're discussing a possible mandatory retraining program, maybe psych evaluation." "Imani, Inspector Johnson. I've been a pilot for over 20 years. This is my life. Without it, Imani sighed. She'd dealt with calls like this from professionals who realized too late they'd crossed lines. Captain Griffin, I appreciate the apology, but the investigation is still ongoing. It's not personal. You mocked me, yes, but more importantly, you dismissed the importance of safety protocols. That's an institutional concern. Now, the system is doing what it was designed to do, evaluate whether you're fit to continue flying. Mark's voice cracked slightly. I messed up. I see that now. I was stressed about finances, family issues. I let it all bleed into my cockpit persona. I know that's no excuse. If you could maybe say a word on my behalf, that I'm not incompetent, I'd be grateful. Imani was silent for a moment. She recalled the old Imani who might have taken pity and tried to fix everything. But her current position required fairness above all else. Captain, your skill as a pilot isn't in question. It's your attitude. This is a chance for you to address that. The FAA might require you to go through anger management or a specialized course, but it's not necessarily the end of your career. You need to prove you can uphold safety and professionalism from now on. Mark breathed heavily, then quietly answered, I understand. After a moment, he added, I am sorry, Imani. I truly am. She believed he was sincere in that moment. People often are once facing consequences. Whether it would stick, she couldn't say. I accept your apology, Captain. Good luck with the hearing. They ended the call. Imani stared at her phone for a while, her mind drifting back to when she was a trainee inspector, starry-eyed but already aware of how prejudice and pride could corrode aviation safety. She thought about Jessica, how she had stood for what was right, despite fear of repercussions. Imani smiled at the knowledge that times were changing, bit by bit. A month later, Imani received an update. Mark Griffin had been mandated to complete a behavior modification program specifically focused on cockpit resource management and communication. His license wasn't revoked, but he was temporarily grounded and needed to pass a series of evaluations. Jessica Harlow sent Imani a triumphant text. He's on probation, but at least he's getting help. I feel safer already. Imani texted back her congratulations, reminding Jessica to remain diligent and supportive, yet firm in her own career path. The chain of events served as a powerful reminder of Imani's mission in the FAA. It wasn't just about rules for the sake of rules, it was about safeguarding human lives, passengers and crew alike. Mark's mocking behavior, fueled by arrogance and stress, could have led to dire consequences under a worst-case scenario. But the system had responded, ensuring accountability. Imani continued her work, traveling from airport to airport, performing inspections, auditing paperwork, and sometimes boarding planes as an undercover passenger. Over time, she realized that with each confrontation and each resolution, she was helping mold a safer aviation industry. She carried her father's memory with her always, remembering how he used to stand at the fence of their local airport, pointing out planes and saying, "Look at that beauty, Imani. One day, you'll be the one ensuring it stays in the sky, safe as can be." She was living that prophecy, each step forging a path for the next generation of women, and especially women of color who would follow in her footsteps. The day she spotted another young black woman wearing an FAA badge at a conference, Imani smiled, offering guidance and camaraderie. The world was slowly changing for the better, and she was proud to be part of that shift. Some months later, she even received an email from Mark, telling her he had passed his evaluations and had a renewed respect for the systems in place. Whether he fully reformed or not, Imani couldn't say, but she liked to believe people could grow when confronted with their misdeeds. And so, from a chance encounter on Flight 722, Imani Johnson reaffirmed her commitment to ensuring the skies remain open and free from prejudice, free from reckless pride, and open to anyone with the dedication to uphold the highest standards of aviation safety. Before you leave this video, remember that real change happens when stories like Imani's are shared far and wide. The aviation world relies on collaboration and accountability. It thrives when each voice, from captain to passenger, is respected for its potential contribution to safety. While Captain Griffin's downfall might feel like comeuppance, it's also a wake-up call for everyone who thinks arrogance belongs in the cockpit. Imani's unwavering courage reminds us that no voice should be silenced because of prejudice or pride. The next time you see an injustice or spot something that just doesn't feel right, speak up. Silence never solved a problem. If you found this tale moving or eye-opening, do your part in keeping these conversations alive. Hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more stories that amplify truth and inspire action. Safe travels.